Here is a motion picture film. Let's tidy up this tangle of film by putting it on a reel.
Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Hello, it's Film Swap.
Shall we try that again?
Sorry, I was just trying to find the origin of that quote at the beginning of
You're worse
about
than
the rats.
You're worse than my kids because you like when you put a screen in front of you, you just can't help yourself. Even when you're on a podcast.
I am like a 7-year-old given a screen, basically.
Well, I think we're all as bad as each other nowadays with these things. Yeah. But anyway, all right, let's try that again.
And hello, it's Film Swap. David? Sorry, what do I say? I can't even remember what I say. Good. No.
Have you just watched Good Morning Vietnam or something?
Don't know. It's the yoga. My brain's slightly addled.
Oh, is it?
Hello, it's Film Swap, and I'm Jonathan Pritchard Barrett, and here is my co-host, David.
Hello, listeners. Welcome. Tonight, we've got a really interesting show. The theme of tonight's program is Jonathan and I's asymmetrical prostates. No, actually, I'm only joking. That's a reference to one of the films we'll be talking tonight, but the actual theme of the show is, in fact, bad reputations. And what that means is we wanted to talk about films that a lot of people in the kind of the public consciousness and public perception, the popular consensus is that these are not very good films. But we wanted to each pick a film and say, no, actually, these are quite good films and worthwhile films. And so we wanted to propose tonight that you take another look at them and see for yourself what you think.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, what film did you pick for me tonight to watch?
Well, it's a daring choice. The film I chose for you is David Cronenberg's Cosmopolis.
Whoa!
From 2012, and it stars Robert Pattinson, and right. I think it's rather good. But many, many, many people beg to differ.
Well, you know what? I'm glad you picked this one because I had not seen it, and I'm a huge David Cronenberg fan, being Canadian myself originally. And David Cronenberg, I grew up with his films, and he's made tons of really brilliant and interesting films. But This one kind of passed me by. I kind of missed out on it when it came out for whatever reason. And it's always been one of those ones I've always been wanting to check out, but I just haven't had a chance. And I do know that it has a bit of a, there's opinions divided on it. So yes. I was very intrigued to finally get around to seeing it. So that's great.
Yeah. Cool. What's your choice then, David?
Well, I picked a film that is very famous. Or perhaps it might be more correct to say infamous, because it is a film that is known in history as the film. It's one of the biggest box office bombs in the history of motion pictures.
Wow.
It is a film that is allegedly brought down a studio, being United Artists, destroyed several promising acting careers, including Chris Christopherson's. So most people, just from the information I've given you, have probably worked out that I'm talking about Michael Cimino's 1980 film, Heaven's Gate.
Wow.
So that is the film that I picked tonight.
I've heard about it, but I've never seen it.
Yeah. Well, tonight we're going to talk about it.
Terrific. Look forward to that.
What we have to do first is I have about 14 white limousines waiting for me outside. And Jonathan and I are going to go and climb in, and we're going to go across town, get our hair cut, and then we're going to go to the cinema and watch these films. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about it for our listeners out there. But listeners, for you, it's actually only going to be a few seconds. So if you just hang in right there, don't go away, don't
Hold
move.
horses.
Yes, hold your horses. And we literally will be right back in just a second. So don't move.
Thanks for listening to the Film Swap podcast. You can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Audible, and Google Podcasts, or any of your favourite podcast catchers. If you like this podcast, please consider giving the show a rating or leaving a review. This helps other listeners find the show. Great stuff. Here we are. We're back. Out of our limousines, off our horses.
Yes. Did you remember to tip the drivers? It was your turn this time, Jonathan.
Oh. Being in Britain, I forgot.
That's right, folks. People who outside of the UK who are listening, you might not realize that they don't really do tipping in the UK.
Horribly mean we are.
So anyway, well, those guys, they won't come back to pick us up next time.
No, we're stranded now.
So anyway, folks, our first film tonight is called Cosmopolis.
Yes.
By David Cronenberg. And Jonathan, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you picked this one?
Well, I am a fan of David Cronenberg's films, the ones I've seen. And this one I chose because we needed a film that had a bad rep. And on IMDb, which I think is a pretty good sort of indicator of film's quality, the film has a mere 5.1, which is really, really low. And that is on a whopping 48,885 votes. So there's a resounding thumbs down,
goodness.
basically.
Is that the tomato? Did they use the tomato meter, or is that somebody else?
Well, the tomato meters, that's Rotten Tomatoes or tomatoes.
Oh, right, of course, Rotten Tomatoes, yeah. Okay.
The Rotten Tomatoes is 66%.
All right, which is more that's respectable.
Yeah, but that's on 188 votes, so I guess that's probably more critics in there, maybe. But the people themselves have definitely said they don't like it, and but I think the film has a lot going for it. Yeah, it's flawed, that is true, but it's still got a lot going for it. So I thought, let's stand up for this film.
Great. Well, I think you've done the right thing, because I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was really interesting.
Yeah.
And there's lots to sink into. I mean, obviously, we don't want we try and keep the show around the hour-ish mark. So we're not going to be able to get like too deep into all of the stuff, but we can touch on some things.
Yeah.
So, so is that fair to say then in both our cases, it was a first time watch, or had you seen it before? It
was, yes. I must confess that I did some sort of searching for films that have bad reps that are actually good, and this is the one that sort of appealed to me most, partly because, as I said, I like Robert Pattinson. But the funny thing is, as I was watching it, first of all, it does take a little bit to get into it, because it's very different to your sort of average film. It's highly stylized. Basically, the whole give you a very brief précis of the film. Robert Pattinson, famous from the Twilight films, it's made in 2012 incidentally, the film. Robert Pattinson travels across New York. He's a bond trader or some sort of bigwig in Wall Street. He's only 28, but he's a billionaire. And he travels across Wall Street during sort of a visit from the president and some rioting. So I think it's basically a sort of Occupy Wall Street rioting type thing is what it's sort of based on. And because he wants to go and get his hair cut, even though his security people have said, don't do it, because there's somebody out there who wants to kill you. But he's insisting, rather than going to the nearby barbers, he wants to go to one on the other side of town. And so he goes on this odyssey in this car. I mean, he does get out occasionally and sort of see people and get into various scrapes. But it's a very peculiar film, but very enjoyable. Once you've sort of shifted your mindset a little bit and you realize, okay, we're not dealing with sort of, standard Hollywood fare here. And we're dealing with a David Cronenberg film, but not even standard David Cronenberg, really.
Yeah. I mean, it's true to say, a lot of his films are highly stylized, and this isn't the first film. Like, if you think about things like Naked Lunch and Crash, which are not necessarily accessible on the kind of standard level.
Yeah.
They take a little bit of work and a bit of acclimatizing to the vibe before you can really start to get in and appreciate it. And I think very much this film is like that. It's got, like you say, it's highly stylized. Yeah. Even the dialogue, what struck me most was the way that people speak is not like a normal...
Definitely.
It almost, it's like they're talking like they're reading a text or something.
Yeah, well, that's true.
It's highly sort of, the verbiage is very, very...
literary.
Yeah, it's very literary, very off kilter sometimes.
Yeah.
Very kind of poetic. Yeah. And it's not the way naturally that people speak. No. But it's incredibly interesting, and it left me constantly focusing on what they were saying.
Yeah.
It really draws you in that way. Because you're kind of like trying to interpret this highly poetic language that they're using.
Yeah. And well, it's interesting that you mentioned Naked Lunch and Crash, because both those films are based on novels by William Burroughs and what's his name, J.G. Ballard. Yeah. And this one is also based on a novel by the American author Don DeLillo, who's one of the greats of American sort of post-war fiction, I suppose, or I think he started writing in the 70s. He was born in 1936, still alive in his 80s now. I think he had published a novel a couple of years ago.
Oh, right.
But one of the interesting things about this is that at Christmas time, I subscribed to Netflix, and the big movie, or there was a few big movies that they sort of put out for the Christmas sort of market, and one of them was this one called White Noise, which was basically based on it was based on Don DeLillo's big sort of crossover novel. That's the novel that sort of made his name. It was published in the 80s, and the film stars Adam Driver, and it's directed by Noah Baumbach, who made The Squid and the Whale. And it's a really good film. But while I was watching the film, I was thinking, wait a second, this is meant to be Netflix's sort of main attraction at Christmas. This is a very, very odd film indeed. And I did enjoy it, but this film definitely has... So I got a feel for Don DeLillo. I'd never read any of his books, but I've now seen 2 adaptations. So that sort of helped when I realized, oh yeah, of course, Don DeLillo writes very odd books.
Well, it's quite interesting that you mentioned about White Noise, because if listeners go back to our very, very first episode, I do remember you talking about that in our little short takes at the end, that was a film that you mentioned as something you'd seen recently that you found quite intriguing and quite interesting.
It is intriguing and interesting. Yeah. I would recommend that film. I'd recommend probably seeing that one before you see this one. Okay. But they're both good, but great films, and they're both about sort of societal breakdown. Because in White Noise, there's a toxic airborne event. So the whole town these people live in sort of flee in a sort of a caravan of cars on all the freeways going out of the town.
Right.
And and in this one, they're sort of also stuck in cars for much of it.
Yes.
And at this time, it's sort of societal breakdown, sort of mayhem in New York.
Mm.
But they got similar sort of themes. The dialogues on, and even the funny thing is, even the lighting was quite similar, because there's sort of very sort of lurid lighting, all sort of oranges and greens in White Noise. And this film had, Yeah, this film had a similar thing. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, Don DeLillo doesn't talk about sort of, well, I would imagine he doesn't talk about the lighting in the, but somehow that's how the directors sort of adapt his words. And interestingly, this is David Cronenberg wrote the screenplay for this one.
Yes.
And apparently it was his first screenplay since Existence in 1999, so sort of came out 13 years before this. Great film. Starring Jude Law, I'd recommend that one.
I like Existence. And it's quite interesting because I read that when I was kind of preparing for our talk tonight, that there was a screenplay already when David Cronenberg came on board.
Oh, right.
And he just basically threw it away and wrote his own, which I suppose, because he is very much a kind of a singular auteur, isn't he? He has definitely his own sort of, approach to material. And I think this film very much is in keeping with thematically with a lot of his films in terms of people's relationship to technology and medicine and all these things, and about how that's kind of changed our, human evolution, if you will, and sort of our relationship to nature and everything as well. Yeah. So I think those kind of themes run through this as well, which I found really interesting as well.
Definitely. And one of the things that sort of now, it seems like the film's quite sort of prescient before its time, because the Robert Pattinson character, when I was watching it, I was thinking, wait a second, because I just started watching a documentary on the BBC about Elon Musk, a three-parter. I thought, this is Elon Musk. This sort of peculiar character. He's got a sort of unusual personality, you might say. And like Musk does, really. I mean, he's a sort of...
Well, yes, just highly intelligent, but and a bit sort of quirky, because obviously he sees the world in a completely, different way to others. And that's kind of a theme through the film, is like his kind of alienation in a sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because he's in a lot of it, as you said, takes place inside this very luxurious limousine that has a very sort of futuristic kind of, there's lots of screens and lights, and it looks very kind of Buck Roger-y. But he's kind of almost like kind of completely sealed off from what's going on around him outside, which I think is a really great theme about about in terms of, because he's an incredibly wealthy person, and his mind is completely sort of obsessed with, and a lot of the people who come on, because throughout the journey, as the film progresses, these other people come on board the limousine to talk to him. I guess they're his lackeys, his employees that he's just summoned along the way and just said sort of, we'll pick you up on the corner of such and such. And they just sort of stop the car and open the door, and they have to hop on board. And then they have these very fascinating conversations. Yeah. They're all kinds of different characters, but it's all around the sort of obsessing about technology and about how to control financial markets and about how things are going to develop into the future and how they can capitalize on that. Yeah. And everything revolves around how they can manipulate things in order to just accumulate more and more wealth.
Yeah. Yeah. And it has quite a sort of star-studded, well, somewhat star-studded sort of cast, I suppose. It's got Paul Giamatti is in it. Yeah. Juliette Binoche is in it.
Very briefly, but she's quite memorably in it. She's quite an interesting character.
Exactly. And Samantha Morton as well. She's his chief of theory, which is a great sort of job title. And then, funnily enough, when I was watching it, it reminded me of this film I saw around the time that this came out called The Holy Motors, or Holy Motors. Directed. It's a French film directed by Matthew Almaric, I think. And then, funnily enough, the director turns up of Holy Motors turns up in this film. He's I think so. Matthew Almeric. I'm sure he's in that film. But it's extraordinary. It really is funny. Yeah, some of the dialogue I like this one. A world citizen with a New York pair of balls. It's great. And so one of the things I was expecting, because old David Cronenberg is famous for his body horror. It's sort of all his horror, but especially his body horror. So, wait a second, where's this? It's just sort of uncharacteristically sort of not quite placid, but sort of not the body horror is not in evidence, and then suddenly it erupts. They're watching some news report from Korea, and then you go, oh, okay. So,
well, there is really these just little striking flashes of violence. I mean, it's not because it's not a strike. I mean, David Cronenberg is essentially known as a horror film director, although not exclusively. He has done things in other genres, if you will.
Yeah.
But this isn't really a horror film, or at least I suppose I suppose you could say it's kind of slightly like a psychological horror film.
Yeah.
But there's these little brief flashes of violence.
Yeah.
And there's even that he's always somehow disconnected from it, which is quite an interesting again, about this, how his whole distance from all the things that are going around. He seems to take a very sort of, unemotional view of everything that's going on. It's all just completely analytical or strategic in his thinking. And he's, and it's something that you talk about Robert Pattinson. He's someone, I must admit, because you mentioned you quite like him.
Well,
and I know he's been...
I didn't say that. I just said I knew he's in this film. I know that he's a popular actor. It was more
he is
the
a
case.
Popular actor, and I think for me, because my only real experience of him up until the last few years ago was in those Twilight movies,
right.
Mainly because one time my partner saw that there was a double feature playing of the first two Twilight films. And this is back when they were new and it was a very big, successful franchise.
Yeah.
And so we went to see them in the cinema, and I sat through these two films that seemed very much, and no offense to any teenage girls out there, but the films did seem very much pitched at a kind of a teenage girls audience.
I think that's entirely fair. Yeah.
And his performance in it was, he was very pasty white, because he was, I think, a vampire or werewolf or something. I can't remember, something to that effect. And he, and he spent a lot of the movie just kind of skulking around, staring at the floor and things, and he kind of mumbled a lot.
Right.
And so he didn't really make a particularly great impression on me as an actor, I think would be a fair thing to say. I've got nothing against the man. Obviously, I don't know him, and I'm sure he's a lovely guy and everything.
Yeah.
But he didn't make a particularly great impression on me.
Yeah.
But then I've seen over the years, he's made a lot of interesting decisions in the kind of films that he's chosen to do, because he had that when the Twilight films were quite popular, he had the option of trying to kind of pursue a big leading man sort of career and try and capitalize on that and go for another big hit or something. But instead of trying to get on Fast and Furious movies or whatever, I mean, maybe he did, for all I know, I don't know. But he's chosen instead to do a lot of smaller independent films. Yeah. Films like this that have a little bit more of sort of artistic pretension, shall we say. Yeah. So and so I got to take my hat off to him that he he doesn't choose just the obvious stuff. He seems to pick interesting projects. He does. And some of them that I've seen, they maybe aren't always particularly successful necessarily. No. And I qualify that by saying just the ones I've seen. Yeah. But I got to take my hats off to him that I think he's quite an adventurous actor and star. And he's definitely really well suited to this, because I think he's very good in this, and he's quite well suited to that sort of emotionally distant, very analytical person who's always seems to want to keep in control of everything.
Yeah.
Which is why I made a joke at the beginning about the asymmetrical prostate, but that in this film there is he basically submits himself daily to a full physical examination by a doctor every single day. That's one of the plot points in this film, because he's obsessed with I don't know, I guess. Yes, with longevity and making sure that he's not going to get sick or that anything gets spotted straight away. Yeah. And then there's a very, very funny moment where he's basically having one of these highly fascinating...
Having a prostate examination, basically.
Yes, he's having a prostate examination while he's also having a conversation with one of his lackeys who's in the car. And they're having this highly... I wouldn't necessarily say intellectual, because they're talking about finance and things, which I don't necessarily equate with intellectual things. But they were having this intense conversation about all this financial business, and while at the same time he's having his prostate examined, and then the doctor just sort of casually goes, You have a asymmetrical prostate.
Which becomes a sort of concern for him for the rest of the film.
Yes, because it's like this thing, like all of a sudden there's something not right, something outside of his control that's sort of like, wait a minute, there's something wrong with my prostate. My prostate isn't normal. It's not. There's something, what does he mean by that? And it becomes like this sort of recurring sort of subject that gets peppered throughout the rest of the film. And I thought that was quite amusing and quite sort of interesting in terms of his character, the psychology of his character, because it's just one thing he's not in control of.
Yeah.
It's like all of a sudden he gets these medical examinations every day, but actually today there was something, the doctor found something abnormal. Yeah. And it's like, so I thought that was really interesting.
That's true. I mean, that examination chat was one bit where it sort of became a bit more Cronenbergian, sort of body horror type thing. Because he's sort of going, sort of trying to chat, but he's finding.
And it becomes almost like it's like difficult. A sexual thing between him and the woman, because it's a woman that he's talking to.
Yeah.
And she was out jogging when she was summoned to come into the car and have, do a detailed report to him about something. And so she's all sweaty and wearing, sort of just tight jogging gear. And she's, and then meanwhile he's naked, and then there's a doctor giving him a prostate exam. Yeah. And so there's almost like there becomes this kind of sexual vibe to the conversation while he's, having the examination, and she's kind of talking to him. And so that's quite a funny moment. It's quite one of several quite kind of interesting, very amusing bits.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and then later on that becomes a sort of issue because somebody says, your asymmetrical prostate is, well, I don't know, he draws some sort of philosophical lesson from it.
Yes.
Yeah, but no,
it's brilliant.
It's really a sort of unusual film, but I would.
What did you make of the rat motif? Because I wasn't sure how to interpret that, and I'd be sort of interested to hear your take on it.
Well, that comes from a quote. The film starts with a quote from Zbigniew. Please excuse my pronunciation. Zbigniew Herbert, who's a Polish poet and essayist, drama writer. And I think the full quote is, if I can... Yeah,
they have it at the very beginning in a little caption at the beginning.
They do, yeah.
But then throughout the film, there is this kind of running, feature of that rats visually prominently factor into the visuals quite often throughout the film.
I think it was stores are empty. A rat became the unit of currency. So I suppose in Poland, obviously Poland went through a lot in the 20th century, so that's sort of pretty, probably factual almost. But I guess here it's a bit more metaphorical. And
Yes.
I think it's sort of about capitalism and the whole sort of enterprise that this Robert Pattinson's character is involved in.
Yeah, and I guess I was thinking it was some kind of reference to nature as well, because obviously rats are very prominent in
That's
nature,
true.
and there's billions of them. Apparently, what's the saying that you're never more than 3 feet away from a rat or something like that? Or I don't know, I can't remember what it is, but there's some saying about implying that they're literally everywhere, all around us. Yet this concept of them becoming a currency,
Yes.
and that I thought was quite an interesting thing.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And one other thing I wanted to comment on was about the custard pie guy.
That was the guy who actually I got it wrong. He wasn't in the Holy Motors, but yes, the French actor anyway.
Yeah, but I thought that whole thing about because the protests, again, he's always quite isolated and cut off. And throughout the film, he's in this car and they're driving through town. And there's all these kind of riots and people sort of smashing up windows. And by the end of the film, the car that he's in, the limousine, has been all sort of painted and kind of destroyed on the outside by protesters and things. But he's still sort of in this cocoon inside, untouched by it. But I thought the scene with the custard pie was quite interesting because this man was so proud of his accomplishment that he describes all these politicians all over the world that he's managed to custer up, as he says, throw custard pie at, and he spent time in jail and been tortured over this. But it's quite interesting about the effectiveness in protests and the difference in terms of, because the wealthy, when they want to protect their interests, they can resort to violence on a much more epic scale, with war and fighter jets and all, CIA and all these kind of things. Yet people, just regular people, all they have is a custard pie, or they don't have that same level of to be able to fight for their interests, except each other, really.
Yeah, well, he's the pastry assassin.
Yes,
that's his name, his title, and I think terrorism is one of Don DeLillo's themes, which he addresses in a number of his books. And I liked also, they're in a diner at one stage, and these sort of terrorists come in, dangling rats by their tails, and sort of flick them across
flick them around,
diner, and then run off.
Yeah, and everybody, again, like most of the people, they just sit there and they might be temporarily disrupted or inconvenienced, but they just shrug it off and go continue consuming, and continue to, and he just looks on in interest.
Yeah,
but there is through it too a strain of self-destructiveness as well, which is quite interesting, isn't there? Because he talks about how he's by the end of the day he's going to lose billions and billions of
he's lost everything,
dollars, pounds, and it sounds like it's kind of like deliberate. It was calculated on some level, or either the risk was. So whether it was intentional for him to actually lose it, or whether just the addiction to the risk and the constant need to try and top and this concept of growth that you hear very much always in when you hear business reports on the news or you read about it, and all businesses are always, there's this obsession with this concept of growth, that there's always got to be more, but of course it's completely unsustainable, and sooner or later everything isn't going to carry on that way. It's not viable.
I have a little quote actually from Don DeLillo when I was doing my research. There's an essay he wrote called "In the Ruins of the Future," and he was writing about the sort of Occupy movement. He said they want to decelerate the global momentum that seemed to be driving unmindfully towards a landscape of consumer robots and social instability, with the chance of self-determination diminishing for most people in most countries, and to hold off the future. And which is interesting. And at the same time, when that was going on, of course, 9/11 happened. And he said, whereas the 9/11 terrorists, rather than wanting to hold off the future, they want to bring back the past, which is a sort of slightly different and much rather more sinister sort of aim. But yeah, so there you go. That's Don DeLillo on the matter.
Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, I must admit, I've not read this book or any of his books, actually. I mean, I'm familiar with him by name, but I've never read any of his books. So I'm intrigued enough that I might investigate that a bit further.
Definitely, me too. I was thinking, I've got to go and read one of these books. If he's one of the great American writers, time I get on it.
Excellent. And David Cronenberg's one of the great filmmakers, and definitely I think, is it fair to say, I mean, I really enjoyed this film. I thought it was really, really interesting and entertaining in its way. I mean, not in a kind of Marvel superheroes kind of way, but definitely
not.
but definitely entertaining. Like there was a lot of food for thought, a lot of humor. Yeah, that I found in it, a lot of very funny bits and really interesting ideas and concepts.
Definitely,
just tossed about throughout the film.
Yeah,
and again, Robert Pattinson, he's very, very good in this. So I take my hat off to him for that. Like he's excellent in this. Yeah, and as is everyone else who's in it, really.
Yeah, it does take a bit of getting into once you sort of adjust your, mindset. But it's an enjoyable film, definitely.
Brilliant. Well, I think in the interest of time, I think we might have to cap it there and move on to the next film, which is a pretty big subject and a pretty big film in and of itself. Yep. So I think what we're going to do is we're maybe going to, go and, towel off and sort of take a moment to, recalibrate ourselves and our prostates. And then we'll... And then we're going to come back after just a very, very brief, from the listener's point of view, very brief break. Yeah. And then we're going to come back to talk about Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate.
Yeah.
So listeners, stay right where you are and keep your ears peeled.
See you in a moment.
We'll be right back.
You can follow the Film Swap on social media. We're on Twitter and TikTok at Film Swap UK, on Instagram at Film Swap Media, and on YouTube at Film Swap_podcast, and at Facebook at Film Swap the Podcast. Hi there, we're back.
And we're back. Right. So, Jonathan, we're ready for our next film, Michael Cimino's 1980 epic Western, Heaven's Gate.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting pairing of films this time, isn't it? Like, because of the subject matter, we've ended up, we've got quite a fascinating couple of films that in a weird sort of way have some thematic undercurrents, I think, that could tie them together in a way.
Definitely. Well, they both have sort of nefarious business interests, you might say. But they also have French actresses in both of them, which you don't get in every American film. But this one both has French actresses, funnily enough.
Well, that's an interesting... You're referring to Isabelle Huppert, who's one of the great actors, film actors of all time. Absolutely amazing talent. But one of the big criticisms at the time that this film was released was about a lot of people felt that she was woefully miscast in this particular film. I'm not sure I agree with that necessarily, because I think aside from the accent, I think she's wonderful in this. And
Terrific.
I think I've never seen her not be wonderful. She's just one of those people who just is on just a whole other level in terms of talent as a film actor. So anyway, shall I talk a little bit about Heaven's Gate?
Please introduce.
I think this is one of these films that is quite infamous. Is the word, because at the time that it was released in 1980, it became and was considered the single biggest box office bomb in the history of film. I think subsequently it's probably been dethroned. There's been several quite high-profile things. And again, a film that I would quite happily put forward if we ever did a Bad Reputations 2 in a future episode, I would put forward Disney's John Carter, which is a film that came out I guess it's been a few years now, maybe about 10 years ago, but that was a very high profile, mega big budget, loads of production problems, went way over budget. It was a big, huge thing. And then it was a huge financial disaster for Disney and was a major bomb. But I would hold up my hand and say that I quite really like John Carter. I think it's terrific, really entertaining, kind of old-fashioned, entertaining science fiction adventure film. So yeah, if you've not seen it, you should definitely go and check it out because I would stand by that. Right. But we're not talking about John Carter tonight. We're talking about Heaven's Gate. Michael Cimino, the director, when he made this film, he was coming off quite a big success story. Previously, really, he started out his career as a writer, and amongst other things, he was involved in what's it called? Silent Running was one of the films that he was the screenwriter on.
What was it?
Which is quite interesting. I didn't know that until I was reading up a bit about him today. But he got his first chance to direct a film in 1974. It came out. It was called Thunderbolt and Lightfoot with Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges. And it ended up being a huge box office success. And then off the back of that, he made another film, a Vietnam War drama called The Deer Hunter, which then became a massive, huge, mega success and won the Oscar for Best Picture. And there was all kinds of awards. And I think it was at the time, because this was just a few years after the end of the Vietnam War. And I think America was open to this concept of a big film about American soldiers as victims. And I think it very much kind of hit the zeitgeist in America at the time and became a huge, phenomenal success. So off the back of that, he was given essentially more or less carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. And he revived a project that apparently he'd first written a treatment for this film back in the late 60s.
Oh, wow.
But he could never get any interest in it. But then after The Deer Hunter, and people obviously, when you're successful, when you've had a big success, and of course, what's that thing that Werner Herzog said? He has this wonderful quote that I love when he says, when you're successful and you stick to your creative vision or whatever, then the money men come chasing after you like curs, or something. I can't remember. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a wonderful little quote. But I think that's the thing. He basically got an opportunity to just do basically whatever he wanted. Right. And this is still in the kind of the new Hollywood era when a lot of projects were sort of being director-driven. And
New Hollywood.
New Hollywood. But it's also around the time that the cracks were beginning to show, because we had a lot of huge, sort of really talented, big, successful directors that were being given the opportunity to just do whatever they wanted. So then you had some quite high-profile films that were unsuccessful, like William Friedkin's Sorcerer, which is another really brilliant film, remake of Wages of Fear, and a few others, like Peter Bogdanovich had one, what was it called? Was it What's Up, Doc? Or am I thinking of something else? But he made a big picture, and it just totally stiffed. And so there was a lot of this going on at the time.
Yeah.
So perhaps it was partly that this atmosphere that this film was created in, that I think the studios and the public and everyone else was getting a little bit wary of these big, huge ego-driven projects.
Yeah, Apocalypse Now, classic.
Yeah, Apocalypse Now. Yeah, brilliant film. But so Heaven's Gate was made. It's a huge, sprawling western. At its heart, it's basically a fictionalized account of what's called the Johnson County Wars, which was basically a conflict between immigrant settlers in Wyoming, is it? And
Wyoming, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and the cattle barons, the kind of big landowners who basically were unhappy. They wanted to keep the land free for grazing cattle and things. So this became violent. And the story is that basically these what they called themselves, Stock Growers Association, is what they were called, and they basically hired a bunch of thugs, hired hands, to come and basically they created a hit list of people that they wanted assassinated, basically. And they had this small private army come in. Apparently, the film alleges anyway, in principle, it was approved by the federal government and the state government for them to come in and enforce law and order as they saw it on these settlers. So what then happened is obviously it just erupted into violence. And this film is a fairly highly, I think, fictionalized account of that. And it's to do with Chris Christopherson plays I guess a wealthy. He comes from a wealthy family, and he comes from Harvard University. And there's this wonderful opening sequence where he's a young man and his friend John Hurt, played by John Hurt, are graduating from Harvard. And there's all the pomp and circumstance of their graduation and all the celebrations of that, which make up a big, huge chunk of the opening of the film. But then the film kind of skips ahead forward about 20 years. And Chris Christopherson is now this kind of more world-weary, cynical marshal. And I guess he's been sent to his old stomping grounds to sort of be the new marshal there. It
doesn't make sense why he's there, does it?
It doesn't really make clear, was he already the marshal, or was he newly assigned to be the marshal? It isn't really clear. Definitely, he seems like he had been away for a while, and he's returned after some sort of a break from being in this neck of the woods, and he's the marshal. So just to clarify, I mean, this film, I think it's a really great film in many, many ways, but I do also fully admit that there are flaws to it as well. Do you think that's fair to say? Because I think the film, in terms of a spectacle and in terms of photography and sheer ambition, in terms of the set pieces and the design and these huge vistas and delights for the eye and ear that you have throughout the film. The story, there's not a lot to the story, is there? It's fairly straightforward. He comes to town. He sees that there's this thing going on, and then he sides with the local people, who are trying to establish themselves and build a community. And then these cattle barons come to aggressively impose their own will on these people, and he takes their side, and it all builds up to a quite a catastrophic and tragic ending. Obviously, we try and avoid spoilers here, so for people who want to watch the film, we don't want to give too much about what happens. So on that, Jonathan, what do you think of the film? I mean, we could talk a little bit about the production history. I think it's pretty well documented about all there was a lot of production problems, and Michael Cimino was very exacting and demanding. He clearly had a very particular vision about what he wanted to achieve.
Yes.
And some of the stories are legendary, the stories about him making them stand around waiting for hours until just the right cloud formation came in the sky. And all sorts of things about tearing down massively expensive $1 million sets and rebuilding them because they were a fraction of an inch in the wrong spot, and things like that. Just like completely sort of over the top. They built these massive irrigation systems just so that the grass would be just the right shade of green. There's all these huge stories about it, about his kind of maniacal obsession for detail. And apparently he was someone who didn't necessarily, he had the kind of personality, he didn't necessarily ingratiate himself to people, shall we put it that way. So I think there was a lot of things like that. My favorite quote from him that I remember reading somewhere is that apparently there was one day when he wanted to work to get something done, and all of his crew were complaining because they wanted to go to lunch. And after this huge, fierce sort of arguments and battles, finally he let the crew, the crew go and have their lunch. And then he said to his DP or somebody, don't they understand that tomorrow, 2 days from now, none of them will remember what they had for lunch, but this film is forever, and it's something like this. And that's clearly about what his mindset was. And he may have had a point, to be fair, that, can you remember what you had for lunch yesterday?
That's true. It's not so much about what I had for lunch, is that more than that I had lunch. And
I don't want
to sort of, I mean, if you're not going to feed your crew, you're probably not going to make a film.
Yes, it is very important.
It is.
Food.
But apparently, many of these stories are in the great book, Easy Riders and Raging Bulls. Which is all about the new Hollywood, and sort of takes you from the beginning with Bonnie and Clyde to the end with this and Raging Bull.
Yes, they were kind of the last two sort of hurrahs of the kind of the new Hollywood kind of movement. And there's a great book that I have on my shelf up here somewhere. It's called The Final Cut. And sorry, I'll see if I can find the author. I can't remember his name. Stephen Bach, I think. And he wrote quite a detailed account of the making of this film, the making and the undoing of this film.
Because I'm looking at a quote from him now.
Well, I actually meant if I'd had more time, unfortunately, there's only so many hours in the day, but I would have loved to go back and revisit that book. So I would have had some more interesting anecdotes or something to talk about this film. But I guess... Sorry, go ahead.
Well, you sort of asked me what I thought of it, and the first thing that came to mind is that it is very long, 3 hours and 40 minutes long. It's one of those films, because this quote that I have in front of me, it says, this is from Stephen Bach, he says, Heaven's Gate was to be the proud centerpiece of the new administration as a studio administration's slate of pictures. And it was going to be, Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, set in the American West. And the funny thing is, those are both great films, especially Dr. Zhivago in the middle of it. I remember watching it, and you got this intermission. It just stops, and it says intermission, and they play music. And this is one of those films. It's so long.
It does indeed have an intermission. Well, depending on which version, because that's another interesting thing. There's actually several versions of this film in circulation.
Right.
So the one that I'm assuming you watched it on streaming.
I watched it on Prime.
You watch it on Prime, yes. The version that's on Prime is the original theatrical version of the film that made its premiere when the film was released in 1980. It only played for a couple of weeks or something in a couple of cities, or maybe just one city in New York or Los Angeles. And then the studio pulled it because there was so much of a negative reaction. There was so much vitriol being thrown at the film that they basically withdrew it. And then basically re-edited the film with Cimino's involvement, it should be stressed.
Okay.
But then it was released widely about sort of 4 months later.
Yeah.
In a cut that was about an hour shorter than the version that you watched on Prime. So that shorter version, nowadays it's very difficult to see it. I actually have a DVD, a French DVD of the shorter wide release version. That, and actually the next to last time I watched this film was I watched that version because I think I just picked up the DVD secondhand or something because I thought, it'd be interesting just to have that shorter cut of the film because I don't think I've ever seen it. So I was just out of idle curiosity, and because I'm a fan of the film, I wanted to check it out. So I got this DVD and I watched it, and actually it isn't that bad. There's a lot of talk when you read about it that they say they cut it to ribbons and it's incoherent. But actually it does really play just more like a condensed version of the film. All the key plot points are there. They just kind of, sort of cut down a lot of the, even a lot of the scenes are still there, but they've just drastically sort of reduced them down.
Right.
So I don't think it's actually that bad. It still plays pretty good. But there's that version that's kind of out there, but I think it's a little bit harder to come by nowadays. I don't know if that DVD is still in print.
Right.
But like I said, because I picked up a secondhand copy, I think for a few quid, just out of curiosity. There's also, if you buy a Blu-ray in the UK, it's available from Second Sight Films, and in America, it's available from Criterion. That version is a director-approved version that Cimino oversaw just a couple of years before he passed away.
Right.
Which it's nearly the same length as that long original version, but I think it's shorter by just a few minutes. He made a few minor cuts, and he cut out the intermission as well. So that the film runs about sort of maybe 3 or 4 or 5 minutes shorter than the version that you watched. So, but I think it's more or less fairly close to the same.
Right.
So, and I do believe there's another, like he did in about 2012, there was something in circulation called the director's cut. But I don't know what the difference between that one is and the other versions that are out there. So there is several versions of the film that are out in circulation. That's just an interesting sort of point about that.
That is interesting. Well, I mean, I'd heard of it. I knew that it was one of the monumental flops, and that it, United Artists, the film studio started by Charlie Chaplin and Mary Pickford, this great institution, was sort of brought down by the film, which is quite sad. But I was sort of slightly wondering, did the critics just... I mean, it's almost... Well, it was unfair. I think their criticism was unfair. This is a really good film. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's good.
It isn't great film, but it's great. There is greatness there. I think it is flawed, as I mentioned, and I think more of that's to do with the kind of the writing and the story, because despite its big sprawling length, I don't think the story, there isn't a lot to it. And I also think, I mean, a lot of the characters are a little bit underdeveloped, and I'm thinking specifically maybe about Jeff Bridges' character. John Hurt is much better defined as a character. And as I mentioned, it's never really explained about Chris Christopherson, how he became. Not that you necessarily need lots of explanation about things. But there is some weaknesses, I think, in it. But I think they are more than compensated by the fact that the film just visually, and just in terms of the sheer ambition of some of the set pieces, is just absolutely incredible. The film is just absolutely ravishing to look at.
Really is.
Every single shot is just gorgeous, and it's got that lovely. I mean, it's in color. It's a color film, but it has this incredible kind of almost sepia tinge to the color. And it really feels like that dusty old west.
Yeah.
And it's got this lovely kind of brownish green sort of hues to it, and very diffuse lighting, and it's just beautiful. Every single image in it is absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
Like, even they'll just have this long, lovely shot of somebody in a carriage going down the thing, but the background will be these incredible cloud formations and the hills in the background, and a bit of sunlight, and you can see just such incredible attention to detail, and so beautiful every single frame, that it's just, in terms of just the sheer filmmaking side of it, the film is just jaw-dropping and incredible.
Well, I would say the John Hurt character, I didn't really understand what he was doing there. There's an English bloke, and he's just sort of being quite sort of annoying, really. But there is another funny story about him. Apparently, because he was so much hanging around whilst nothing happened, he flew back to England, filmed The Elephant Man with David Lynch, and came back, and they were still basically hanging around, waiting for something to happen.
There was apparently a lot of hanging around on set, and there was a lot of musicians who were in the cast.
Yeah.
And apparently they just spent hours and hours having these amazing jam sessions and things because they were just basically sitting around waiting for these clouds to come into view, or while they were setting up this very exacting lighting. And, so yeah, there's amazing. But I mean, John Hurt's character is interesting because he's Chris Christopherson's boyhood friend. They went to Harvard together. Yeah. They're friends. And obviously they're both wealthy. They come from wealthy backgrounds. But John Hurt has fallen in with these cattle barons, and he's part of this group. But he obviously, in his heart, he objects to what's happening. But he's a bit of a drunkard, and he doesn't have the kind of moral courage to really stand up to them and what they're doing. And you can see he's quite troubled by it, and it's almost like he's kind of caught up in this self-loathing as he kind of stands around as this ineffectual bystander, while all of his rich mates do these horrible things and are kind of destroying the community. And he'll speak up, but it's always in these kind of sarcastic, he makes little sarcastic comments and little asides, but he doesn't really have the moral courage to kind of stand up and say no and do something to stop it. And I think that's why his character's a bit kind of interesting. And of course, John Hurt, he could probably take the back of a cereal box and make it interesting because he's such an amazing, talented actor.
Yeah. You got these extraordinary characters, extraordinary acting talent.
Absolutely amazing.
Chris Christopherson and
Yeah, and I mean, this film's interesting because apparently at the time, Chris Christopherson was considered one of the biggest box office draws in America. He'd come off a string of really big hits, including what's the one, A Star Is Born with Barbra Streisand, and he was in Convoy and a couple of other really big sort of hit films. And he was riding high with his career at the time, and then he did this film. And apparently after that, he couldn't get work as an actor for many years. Completely occasionally now, as he's gotten older, he's started cropping up again in smaller character parts. And he featured quite prominently in the Blade films, didn't he, as kind of his sidekick. But his career as a big leading man star was derailed by this film.
Right. So odd. But apparently, basically he's in this sort of love triangle with old
Christopher
Walken and Isabelle Huppert. But I think that works pretty well.
And it's quite central to the story. Is that little love triangle between them, And that's where the kind of the character arcs come, certainly with Christopher Walken's character, because at the beginning of the film, although he comes from sort of the same background as a lot of these local immigrants that are being picked on and terrorized and things, and he's a party to that. He's sort of a paid enforcer for some of these cattle barons, and he goes out and basically kills people who they accuse of stealing cattle and things.
Yeah.
But he clearly, through the course of the film, has a change of heart, and there's a character arc there that's quite pivotal, I think, to the story.
Well, two things I really want to mention are the dances. There's these two dances. Yeah. One at the beginning. Incidentally, the bit in Harvard, apparently Harvard wouldn't let them film there, so they had to film that bit in Oxford.
Yes. And they moved a tree. There's a famous story that there was a particular tree that he wanted.
Yeah.
So they actually dismantled it, shipped it over to England, put it back together so that they could use it to film the sequence. So it's stories like that are quite extraordinary.
Extraordinary. But there's this bit where they're sort of waltzing around this tree in the sort of quad or the courtyard. And it's just beautiful, really beautiful. And then later on,
the dancing and the sequence with the dancers, like these huge, they're out on the lawn all dancing, and it's just these sumptuous sort of images that are just so incredible.
Really beautiful, really beautiful. And then the second dance, which is equally fantastic, or maybe more fantastic, but just really good anyway. It's this roller skating barn dance.
Yeah.
And that's where the film gets its name from. So Heaven's Gate is the name of this, basically it's a roller disco, essentially, except rather than sort of disco, it's sort of bluegrass they're playing, I suppose. And
and it's where the community comes together. I mean, these are all poor people. They're farmers, just local merchants. They don't have a lot of wealth, but they all come together and hang out. And Jeff Bridges is the proprietor of this establishment. And it's kind of where the community comes together. And they have these beautiful moments, which a lot of the criticism centered around these big, long, huge, sprawling scenes of people just dancing and partying and stuff. And that was one of the criticisms. But actually, it's one of the key things of the film that just makes it so wonderful, because they're so atmospheric and so joyful and so incredible in terms of the design of the of the places and all the filming and the lighting and everything just looks so amazing that you can just sit there and just get totally absorbed in these scenes that they do go on quite a while, but you never are conscious of that. You're never sitting there. I mean, obviously some reviewers were, but
I was completely happy with that. And I love the music as well. I like that sort of music, so that wasn't a problem for me. In fact, I would have been happy if they'd gone back there, back to Heaven's Gate and done another dance.
Exactly. And that comes a key focal point in the community where everyone gets together, because even at various stages in the story, the community comes together to talk about what's going on or to get organized. And it's always in Heaven's Gate. This is like a central part where they all come together. And it's all people from they've obviously come from different countries and immigrated to America. And then they've come together in this community, but then they're all threatened by these external forces. And it's amazing. And as I said, without spoiling it for someone who's going to go and watch the film, it does escalate into this
Johnson County War, basically.
Yes, into conflict. And then the end part of the film, these huge battle scenes are just extraordinary. That bit, just watching it again earlier today as I was getting prepared for the show, that stuff with when they first all charge in quite unstrategically, not very cleverly, they all come piling in.
Didn't make sense to me.
To me, it was probably not a good move. They were very disorganized. But there's this incredible thing where they're all circling around with their wagons circling the baddies and kind of going around, and with all the dust and the light from the sun that's just kind of setting, and they're all sort of circling around this thing. And it's just such an extraordinary scene. Apparently incredibly dangerous. There was all sorts of accusations of animal cruelty on the set of this film, and a lot of sort of accidents and things that went on. But you can all see it on screen, like just incredible visual, marvel looking at these incredible scenes at
Definitely
the
not
end.
CGI.
No, there's no CGI here at all. It's all real people, sometimes hundreds of them. And it must have taken hours to choreograph that and plan it and get it just right. Every image is just so extraordinary that, and it's quite an amazing film. And I think at the time, a lot of the negative reaction to it must have just been, because a lot of times in the media, you can see there's like a real kind of herd mentality, isn't there? I mean, you can even see it today in kind of social media and stuff, but there's very much, everyone kind of jumps on the bandwagon when they want to, get at something. And I think this film had a bad reputation before it even came out because it was all the talk of all the production problems and all the stuff that was going on. And I think too, because the film is a bit more critical about American, I don't know, how should we say, commerce and, politics and things rather, but more so than the Deer Hunter. I think there might have been a little bit of a negative reaction to that as well about some of the subtext of the film, maybe from a mainstream media point of view, maybe wasn't so welcome. So I think that might have had something to do with why everyone jumped on trashing it a little bit as well.
Yeah. Well, apparently there are some other films based on the Johnson County War, sort of classic westerns. I think The Virginian and Shane are both based on the Johnson County War. And I don't know if they were criticised, but... Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really, really enjoyable. Long. I had to watch it over 2 nights because it was sort of just so lengthy. But and some of the dialogue was great as well, or not great. It was it was enjoyable, sort of quotable, and but also the film was not afraid of bits where there was no dialogue. They were just sort of doing stuff, or not even doing stuff. It was just sort of bit of silence, which I guess is a mark of a film I'm going to probably enjoy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and there's sometimes there's so much of it just is about the just really incredible images, and he was not afraid to let that play out. So you do have these long, lovely shots, scenic shots of people just in the foreground or in the background. And just letting things happen. And that bit at the beginning too, the town, when he first gets to town and he gets off the train and he meets an old friend of his who's like working as a sort of concierge or something in the
station master.
In the station master, sorry. And they're talking out in the street, and there's so much noise and bustle and just these incredible buildings, and there's literally just like hundreds and hundreds of people all around and stuff going on in the background. And it's just incredible, just coordinating all that, just from a filmmaking point of view.
Yeah, the buildings, which he presumably got built, because I would imagine they're not there anymore. I mean, they sort of look like genuine, large Victorian buildings, but that's actually another thing that I did wonder if that didn't contribute to its sort of problems at the box office, where sometimes I found the sound a bit difficult to hear, dialogue.
Yeah, some of the mix. And I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but there are times when, and specifically in that scene, where the two of them are talking, and it is difficult to hear them because there's so much noise from the extraneous around them going on that it becomes a bit difficult to make out what they're saying.
Yeah.
But I guess it probably would have been like that, and certainly there was so much going on that it must have been totally impossible to get a good, clear recording of that anyway. But what's interesting is that they didn't choose to post-sync that to improve that. They left it as it was.
Yes.
So on some level, that must have been conscious decision, because I'm quite sure when they were, mixing the film, they must have said, "Oh, this doesn't sound that great." But there was a conscious decision to leave that as it was.
Yeah.
I guess maybe just because that, I guess, is what it would have been like standing. I don't know if you've ever had that experience of standing on a street corner or in a pub or something where they've got loud music and loads of people talking.
Yeah, of course.
Certainly as I get older, maybe my hearing's not quite as good. I sometimes find it difficult to communicate effectively in noisy environments.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what that scene is like as well. That they're out in the middle of the street with hundreds and hundreds of people around them and loads of noise and stuff. And so maybe it was just a creative decision to just say, well, that's what it would have been like, so leave it.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, I think, what's the final verdict then? What would you say to someone who says, "Oh, Heaven's Gate, I heard that's a bit crappy, that film"? What would you say?
If you've got a sort of wet afternoon when you can't really do much else, I'd say get it on. It's
Sorry, you mean get the film on, just to clarify?
No, more like the song. Then watch the film. If you've got time.
Get it on, and then if there's any time left over, go and watch it.
Yeah, well, no, either or both. But no, it's a terrific movie.
Ideally, both. Yeah.
Ideally both. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, really, really good. And now I'm glad I've seen it, because I read Easy Riders and Raging Bulls, when it came out sort of 20 odd years ago, and sort of always wondered, because it mentions so many different films, and some of them I've seen, not all of them. And now that's one of the key movies I've finally seen. So that's good.
Yeah. And for me, I'm quite happy to come out and talk about it. And when we decided to do this theme, this was pretty much the first film that sprung to mind, because I know it still does. Although I think in recent years, there's been a bit of a reappraisal, and I think it's had there's a bit more positive.
Yeah.
It's been there's more people who've come in its defense and said, actually, this is quite a remarkable film, and it's worth seeing. And I'm of that view. I mean, this is a film that I remember back when it came out in my formative sort of teenage years, when I was really getting into my love of movies and things.
Yeah.
This was one that really made an impression on me, and has been a favorite of mine. Just probably for that, partly for the nostalgia of the impression that it made on me back then.
Yeah.
But also, I just think it's a really great film. It's worth sitting down, as you say, when you've got time to relax and get into a nice long film and devote the time and the energy to it. It definitely pays off, because it builds up to a very, very powerful climax, and it's a really, really interesting film.
It is.
So
check it
people go out and check it out. So as I mentioned, I guess I'll just quickly mention that it is available from Criterion on Blu-ray, Second Sight on Blu-ray in the United Kingdom. And I know there's other, for our sort of European people on the continent, I know that there's a French and Spanish Blu-ray editions as well.
Okay.
So I think it's pretty widely available and easy to come by, and it's also available on all the streaming services for rental or purchase as well. So get out there, folks, and seek it out and watch it. You won't be disappointed. It's great stuff. And hopefully we did it some justice tonight in our conversation. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. We probably could have done just a whole episode just talking about that. Jonathan, was there anything else you wanted to say before we say goodbye?
Well, probably the last thing I'll say is the sort of written outside Heaven's Gate, the sort of roller disco, there's a little quote, and it says, "Skating cures nervous disorders." So that's a thought we could all go home with.
Okay. I think because that's an important food for thought. And on that note, listeners, I think we're going to wrap it up tonight. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you'll go out and check these films out because they're pretty cool. And I also hope you'll come and find us on YouTube, where you can see our fabulous, funky film factoids. And there'll be other cool stuff coming your way. We've got some really interesting guests lined up for the next few shows. So make sure you follow us or subscribe to us so that you don't miss out when we drop the next one.
Definitely.
So, Jonathan, I think you're going on holiday, aren't you?
I am. Going to France.
In the next couple of weeks. Oh, lovely. You're going to France. So I hope you and Autumn and the kids have a lovely time out there.
Thank you.
And we will be back, listeners, very, very soon. So take care until then and watch lots of cool films.
Definitely.
We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Oh, the things these nerdy middle-aged men get up to.